So back when I was breastfeeding my children, I was told that they have to be supplemented with vitamin D because there's no vitamin D in breast milk. And, at the time, which was from 13 years ago to about, within the past decade or so, at the time, and including up till today, we're told that if we have low vitamin D, and remember, that's just what they test is just the quote unquote storage version in the blood. And we're told if we have vitamin D, we are going to predispose ourselves to get autoimmune diseases, cancer, neurological disease, you name it. Now, in a previous video, I talked about how causation and correlation are not the same thing, right? So they're correlating a low vitamin D and saying it's the cause of these disease conditions, when in fact, it's just a marker of an active inflammatory cascade happening in the body. Go listen to the previous video if you want more details on that. But now going back to the breast milk story. So, I was basically told breast milk contains no vitamin D. And look, low vitamin D, if your kids have low vitamin D, they're going to be predisposed to all of these different diseases. You don't want them to get all these different diseases. So you have to supplement them with vitamin D supplements. And it didn't sit right with me at the time because I kept thinking to myself, why would nature, we've had millennia and millennia and millennia to optimize breast milk to be the perfect food for the baby. So why, if the breast milk, quote unquote, doesn't contain vitamin D, why would I have to supplement? And why would I even supplement if I know that I can get them sunlight exposure, and that sunlight exposure can actually allow their body to make vitamin D? So I never supplemented. I never supplemented my children or myself with it because it just didn't make sense. I'm kind of learning what I was learning at the time. But it still hung over my head like, well, I know vitamin D is very important. So why wouldn't breast milk have any? It's got a whole bunch of other amazing nutrients. It's a nutrient powerhouse for baby. Why wouldn't breast milk have vitamin D? And sure enough, and again, I always going back to making sure I give credit to Jim Stevenson Jr. He sent me one of his Substack articles a while back now. And it was the deepest dive I had ever seen into water-soluble vitamin D found in breast milk. So let me break this down, right? So this blew my mind. And it blew my mind because I realized since literally like the 1960s, they had found vitamin D in a water-soluble version. The type that we test in the blood is a fat-soluble version, right? We hear about fat-soluble vitamins, meaning in order for our body to pull those vitamins in and utilize them, they have to be consumed with fat. So that's vitamins A, D, E, and K. And so we've always classified vitamin D as a fat-soluble vitamin, and that there's no water-soluble form. For example, water-soluble forms of vitamins are things like vitamins B and C. Anyone who's ever taken a vitamin B supplement and has seen bright yellow urine understands that that vitamin B can be put into water, aka urine, and flushed out of the body. And so there was a huge assumption about the fact that there is no possible way that vitamin D could ever be water soluble. But they've literally known this since the 1960s. Okay. So back in the 1960s, they were studying what they call sulfated vitamin D. Anytime you attach a molecule called a sulfate group to something, and they're always attached to hormones. So that's going to tell you something right there as well. We're misnaming this. This is not a vitamin. It is a hormone. When you attach a sulfate to a hormone, you allow it to be transported through the blood. And that transport through the blood allows it to, because the blood is a delivery method to get things to the cells, and because there's fluid in between the cells, and because the cell itself is a fluid environment, it allows for appropriate transport of these hormones in their sulfated version to get to the cells where they need to go. So we can sulfate vitamin D, and not just one version, we can sulfate multiple. Remember, there's multiple metabolites of vitamin D, and we can sulfate multiple metabolites. We can sulfate melatonin. We can sulfate our steroid, our sex hormones, right? We can sulfate all of our hormones. And when they're sulfated, and again, they get sulfated when ultraviolet B light touches the skin, that allows us to sulfate our hormones to make them water soluble and transport them through the body. And because the breast milk does have some fat, but it's full of a huge portion that's water. And I mean, Anyone who's breastfed before will know that. Remember picture that initial letdown of milk. That initial letdown of milk, that is pure water, and it's not until the baby nurses for quite some time. It's not pure water, right? But that is the water rich portion, and it's not until baby nurses for a little while that you start to get the milk, the milk fat into it, right? The more fattier portion of the breast milk. And so a huge part of breast milk is just a watery environment, and it's full of sulfated vitamin D. So, and that's beautiful, right? Because that means that is a beautiful water soluble version that that baby can consume. That water soluble version can go right into the blood and can get transported wherever baby needs it. And so, but unfortunately, back when it was discovered, apparently they called it inert, because they were really at the time, and also from then onward, they were basically just studying the effects of vitamin D on calcium, right? They were saying, oh, look, vitamin D can mobilize calcium. And so that's why you hear, if you supplement with vitamin D, you need to take vitamin K to help make sure that the calcium stays in the bones and you don't get this hypercalcemia where calcium can leave the bone and get deposited in the soft tissues and the arteries, things like that. But you don't have to worry about that when you've got the water soluble version of vitamin D. But again, they called it inert. And what I found fascinating, and this really bothers me with the research, because out of all the dozens of metabolites of vitamin D that have also been discovered, such as lumisterol, tachysterol, toxosterol, those are versions of vitamin D. And whenever they're discovered, they're always called inert. They're like, oh yeah, this is a version of vitamin D, but it's inert. Inert in scientific language is another way of saying we don't know what it does. And so because we don't know what it does and we don't want to look stupid, we're going to call it inert. But instead, I think it would be much more appropriate to say we don't know what it does, but the human body is beautifully intelligent and doesn't do things for no reason. And so certainly this water soluble version of vitamin D must play a role. We just don't know what it is yet, right? And so vitamin D in this water soluble form exists all throughout our blood. And interestingly, that version of vitamin D is not dependent on seasonality. I'm going to repeat that. It's not dependent on seasonality, meaning I will have a plethora of that that water soluble sulfated vitamin D in my blood, regardless of whether it's summer or whether it's winter. So yes, we might see shifts and changes in that storage form of the fat soluble vitamin D that gets tested when there's active inflammatory cascades happening. Yes, absolutely. But that sulfated vitamin D stays consistent, barring that we actually get, I'm under the general assumption, which I think is accurate, that we still need to get adequate sunlight exposure of UVB to stimulate that sulfation process in the first place. We have to be able to sulfate our cholesterol, sulfate our vitamin D, sulfate our hormones, and that is done through UVB light. So if we sulfate our vitamin D, that sulfated vitamin D, then that will literally saturate our bodies. And so if you go, like, let's say I hear this happening all the time. I have people who say, well, Carrie, I sunbathed all summer. I'm tan as I've ever been. And I got my blood tested for 25-OHD, the storage form of vitamin D, and it's low. Number one, there's a whole history that I'm going to talk about in my vitamin D webinar. Coming up, you can see more about it in the description of this video. But I'm going to talk about the history of that vitamin D marker and what the quote unquote adequate range was and how that increased drastically. And there's some controversy behind that I'm gonna reveal in that webinar. But this vitamin D, this sulfated vitamin D, so I've had clients who've like sunbathed, they're tan, they're assuming that when they get that storage version of vitamin D tested, they're assuming that it is going to be 80, 90, like really elevated vitamin D. Body's not stupid enough to keep elevated fat soluble hormones in the blood, right? That is just going to get optimized. But what never gets tested, and what I'm going to guarantee you will remain adequate, would test that it's in a very healthy range if they could test for it at your doctor's office, is this sulfated version of vitamin D. And so again, another instance where we're barking up the wrong tree when it comes to testing this one marker that's been used as the global marker of your vitamin D status, when it's actually not true at all. So yes, we've got vitamin D in the breast milk. It's in a water-soluble version. For forever, they didn't know what that water-soluble version did, so they assumed it was useless. The human body does not make useless things. So the innate intelligence of the human body says that, okay, if I'm going to need to transport an important substance through the blood easily, let me make it in a sulfated version so that it can easily get transported through the blood, through the interstitial fluid, and to get to the cell. So there you have it. There is a very important version of vitamin D, yes, in the breast milk. I personally, this is not medical advice for you, but I personally would not supplement it because I know how we can make it through sunlight exposure on the skin and how that sulfated version stays consistent year round. So I look forward to talking with you next time.